سعداء باستضافة صوت صحفي أمريكي جريء زي كريس هيدجز معروف بتغطية مناطق الحروب والنزاعات للشرق الأوسط. أهلا بيك في مصر وخصوصا في المصري اليوم. Chris, what are the details of the project that you are working on to document the ongoing genocide in Gaza?
Well, before I begin, Angie, I just want to say it's an honor to be here with you, with the courageous journalists at المصري اليوم, of course my friend Mohammed Samawi, and my good friend Khaled El-Bashi, who I have tremendous respect for. And I think we also have to honor the journalists in Gaza, over 120 of whom have been killed, many of whom, of course, in targeted assassinations. And I and many, many other journalists hold them in awe and deepest respect. Their courage in the face of this campaign of mass slaughter is really unparalleled. We've never seen numbers like this. I've covered many wars. I've never seen journalists killed in these numbers. And before I begin, I just want to honor the work that you do, and of course honor the work that my Palestinian colleagues in Gaza do. I have written quite a bit about the genocide since it began after October 7th. This has been a very contentious topic in the United States. Those of us who speak about the genocide come under a lot of pressure, and there are constant attacks in an attempt to shut down our voices. The courageous students in the United States who stood up in these encampments have suffered punishment from the universities, suspension, expulsions. There's really been a terrible collaboration on the part of Western governments, in particular the United States, to perpetuate this genocide. And ideally, I would go to Gaza. The Israelis will not allow me to go to Gaza, and so I am working with a cartoonist, Joe Sacco, who wrote the book Palestine and Footnotes in Gaza, and we are interviewing Palestinians from Gaza right now in Egypt, because the object of the Israeli campaign is erasure, to erase the Palestinians as a people, to erase their culture, their history, physically erase their universities, their mosques, their homes. And both Joe and I want to do our small part in documenting and preserving the voices of these Palestinians so that they will not disappear. And that is the project. We're not using official documents. We're doing extensive interviews. So when we interview Palestinians from Gaza, we will usually spend 2-3 hours at least. Because the power of, I think, the book, which is true in other books that I've written, comes with the details. Comes with the small things that oftentimes in journalism we overlook, or because of space constrictions, we don't have time to write. Joe will draw scenes from the interviews. I mean, for instance, we interviewed someone, and when they fled from their village because Israel had created a red zone, the quadcopters or the drones actually followed after the fleeing people and shot them and killed them as they were trying to flee. It's moments like that that are extremely important. A woman whose house was destroyed, and she goes back and sits on top of the rubble and weeps. And of course, we have interviewed people who have been physically injured quite seriously, but we will collect all of these interviews to give a complete picture. There will be a visual element to it. Joe's a cartoonist. And I did a book with him called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, out of the poorest pockets of the United States, so that 50 pages in the book were his panels, his drawings. And that's the same thing we will do in this book on the genocide, because obviously we want people as much as we can to feel the suffering of the Palestinians, and I think that often is enhanced by an ability to see, to have a visual image to go with it. So that's what we're planning to do. That's what we are doing in Egypt, and that's what we're working on.
Chris, what is the ultimate goal of this documentation? And is there any intention to present it to the international courts?
That's an interesting question. So I covered the war in Bosnia, and when Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were tried in The Hague, the lawyers who were prosecuting them presented some of my reporting. It wasn't the intent of that reporting directly to prosecute them, but I was pleased that my reporting was used, because when people commit genocide, when people commit atrocities against the innocents, oftentimes for those of us who are reporters, we have to document that with great risk, and we do so because if we're not there, if we don't write it, those who are carrying out these atrocities will achieve their goal of disappearing that history, which is of course what Israel is trying to do. So if the interviews that we carry out are used in any way to prosecute Israel, I would be thrilled. That's not the ultimate intent of the book. The ultimate intent of the book is to make sure these stories are preserved, that these stories don't disappear, that these stories are not erased. But it's certainly, I think that for me the definition of a journalist is to hold power accountable. And the more we can hold power accountable, the more just our world becomes. And that was certainly true in the war in Bosnia. These people were finally prosecuted. I don't have as much hope that war criminals like Netanyahu or Galants and others, and let's be clear, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are war criminals under international law. They are collaborators in genocide. I certainly would love to see them held accountable, and if any way my work could contribute to them being held accountable, I would be very, very pleased.
Chris, how do you view the role of journalistic documentation in the face of attempts to erase the truth?
The Western press has collaborated in the propaganda that has been spread by the Zionists in several ways. First of all, the Western press has been denied entry into Gaza. This is unprecedented. The only time any Western journalists go into Gaza is when they're escorted by the IDF, the Israeli military, and they engage in what we journalists call dog and pony shows. They're shown, for instance, a calendar in Al-Shifa Hospital and told that this is a list of terrorists. I mean, just blatant lies. They're manipulated. They end up being trapped within Israel and repeating Israeli propaganda. So that's number one. Number two, and this angered me immensely, in the United States, the press demonized the students who I think are the conscience of our country, who decried and opposed the genocide by saying that they were anti-Semites, and we should be clear, about 30% maybe of those students were Jewish, and that they were supporters of Hamas, neither of which is true. Basic journalism would have required them to go to those encampments, spend time there, and find out what they were about. But from the moment the genocide started, there was an attack. For instance, Columbia University, which has been one of the worst, outlawed Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace immediately after October 7th, before there were any protests, before there were any encampments. This was very, it was of course inexcusable as an act of journalism, but it also laid the groundwork for the persecution of those who speak out about the genocide, which of course now under the Trump administration, we're seeing student visas revoked, we're seeing people who have green cards, legal status in the United States seized and stripped of their legal status, and the press was a full partner in creating an environment where this was possible. So there's been a tremendous failing on the part, I speak as an American, on the part of the American press, including my old employer, the New York Times. And it's a bankruptcy. It's bankrupt journalism. There's no excuse for it, and it's frankly been an embarrassment.
Do you think journalism has become a crime in Gaza?
In every war that I covered, journalism was considered by those who were carrying out massacres and war crimes to be a crime. That was true in El Salvador. I covered the war there for 5 years. 22 journalists, my colleagues, were killed. That was true when I covered the war in Bosnia. 45 journalists were killed. That was true in Iraq. American forces killed, if you remember, Al Jazeera journalists by firing on where they were, the building where they were. They killed Reuters correspondents. That's what the video collateral murder showed. So in every war, those who want to hide what they're doing seek to threaten, to block, and even to kill those who are attempting to report the truth, which is why Israel has carried out the mass slaughter of journalists in Gaza, because they are attempting to hide the genocide. What is different about Gaza are the numbers. I've never, in any war that I've covered, I've never seen numbers like this. But yes, that's common to war. Those who carry out war consider those of us who attempt to document what they're doing to be criminals. And of course, attempt to demonize it in the way, for instance, when I covered the war in El Salvador, I was accused of supporting the FMLN rebels. When I reported the war of Sarajevo, I was accused of being a tool of the Muslim government. Same was true in Kosovo. That's what happens. And that's why the Israelis will attempt to argue that they're not journalists. They are working for Hamas. And the goal is to essentially block that information, and if they have to kill people to do it, they will do it. The Israelis have just done it in staggering numbers.
What is the message that you send to the Palestinian journalists who are risking their life to tell the truth?
The message is that we honor you, we admire you. Your courage is an inspiration to all of us. That no matter what they do to us on the outside who denounce this genocide, it's nothing compared to the risks that you are taking, and we are humbled by your courage.
You have already used the term of genocide from the beginning of the war. Why that?
Well, because the clear goal, and it's publicly stated by Israeli officials, is to destroy Gaza, to make it uninhabitable. That was from the beginning. But I think also because I spent 7 years covering the conflict, I understood that the project, the Zionist project, was always about the complete erasure and removal of the Palestinians. That happened in 1948 in the Nakba. In large numbers, 750,000 Palestinians were pushed out of their homeland. Again in 1967, the 1967 war, 350,000 Palestinians were forced off their land. But in between and after, there was perhaps what we would call a slow motion ethnic cleansing. The gradual expansion of Jewish colonies in the West Bank. We now have over 700,000 Jewish colonists in the West Bank. The seizure of aquifers, the seizure of land. And what October 7th gave the Israelis was the excuse to complete this Zionist project, but it was always their intent from the beginning. So that's why from the beginning I called it a genocide, which was very controversial at first, but I think I've been proven correct.
Okay, so some people think that October 7th was the beginning of this war. What's your comment? What's your opinion?
Well, that's what the Israelis and the Zionists want you to think. and they want you to ignore the 16 years that Gaza was the world's largest prison camp. They want you to ignore the savage attacks that Israel carried out, whether Operation Cast Lead, the March of Return. Remember, hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians were murdered wantonly by Israeli forces for nonviolent protests. And it's all about context. They don't want you to see October 7th in context, which isn't to defend some of the actions that happened on October 7th. But when you treat, and I think this was something that I and other reporters in Gaza kept writing over and over and over in the 7 years that I covered Gaza, when you treat people like animals, when you deny them their dignity and worth, when you kill them as if they're beasts, the cruelty you inflict on them will finally be inflicted on you. That, again, is not to condone it, but to understand it. Israel essentially was paid back in the currency or the language by which it spoke to the Palestinians. And it was inevitable. I think those of us who spent a lot of time in Gaza understood that. The scholar Norman Finkelstein has described what happened on October 7th as a slave revolt. I think that's correct. He has drawn parallels between the slave revolt carried out in the United States by Nat Turner. Nat Turner killed every white that he saw. Again, it's not to condone it, but we have to understand it. It was a slave revolt. Remember, the people who burst into Israel, many of them had never in their entire lives been outside of Gaza, ever. They'd been trapped in Gaza. As you know, in Gaza, when they speak about the Israelis, they use the Arabic word Yahud. And why? Because every interaction that they have had with an Israeli or with a Jew is menacing, threatening, and they have never had an interaction with a Jewish person that has expressed compassion, kindness, or understanding. And that's, there's a biblical passage, you reap what you sow. Well, this is what Israel sowed. The inhuman conditions by which the Palestinians were held in Gaza provoked a response, a violent response, but that was completely predictable, and I would say that it is always the oppressor who determines the acts carried out by the oppressed. It was Israel's decision to speak exclusively to the Palestinians in the language of violence, and that was finally the language that the Palestinians, or some of them, spoke back. Just one more fact. This is not a war against Hamas.
Yeah.
This is a war against Palestinian civilians. Hamas, they can shelter in the tunnels. The civilians cannot. It is clearly an act of genocide. Israel is quite conscious of the fact that they are murdering and killing people who had nothing to do with October 7th.
How do you explain the West's insistence on labeling Palestinian resistance as terrorism?
Well, every resistance group that I've covered in the 20 years that I was a foreign correspondent, all of these groups were attacked as terrorists. Resistance groups don't have conventional armies. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, they don't have a navy, they don't have artillery, they don't have mechanized units, they don't have an air force. They don't have the kind of industrial weapons that the Zionist soldiers have. And so they can't get into an F-16 and bomb an Israeli military post. If they carry out an attack, it's with a suicide bomber. Because those are the only tools they have by which they can fight back. All resistance groups that I've covered will use terrorism as a weapon. And so did the Ergon and the underground Jewish groups that fought the British before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And that's common. But it is not true that Hamas or any of these groups are terrorist groups. They don't carry out terror for the sake of terror. They are attempting to break free from Israeli occupation. And they use the weapons that they have, which are far, far inferior and far less deadly than the weapons that the Israelis use. Remember, Israel is dropping 2,000-pound bombs in the middle of refugee camps. The goal is to demonize, on the part of governments like the United States or the Zionists, to demonize resistance groups as terrorists and essentially block questions into the atrocities and abuse that are carried out by the Israeli occupiers. That's very common. Remember, Nelson Mandela and the ANC in South Africa were labeled terrorists. And that's common in every conflict that I've covered. But of course, they're not terrorists. They are fighting for the freedom of the Palestinian people.
Chris, you make distinction between the violence carried out by resistance groups and colonial violence. Can you explain it, please?
That's a very important point. And it's something that C.L.R. James, when he writes his book on the Haitian slave revolt, Black Jacobins, draws out. Because when the slaves, and Haiti, of course, was the only successful slave revolt in human history, rose up, they did carry out acts of violence against the white slaveholders. But James writes that these were momentary passions, like October 7th. And we can't compare that kind of violence to the organized, systematic, institutional violence that Palestinians endure every single day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. This is a far greater violence. And those institutions, those forces, those states that carry out this systematic violence not only seek to normalize it, but they seek to divert the world's attention to the sporadic or momentary eruptions of violence, like October 7th, rather than the far more destructive acts of violence that come with colonization.
To what extent do you believe American unconditional support to Israeli occupation threatens the stability of the Middle East?
I think the United States bears a great deal of responsibility for the instability in the Middle East, not only because of their backing of the Zionist project, but also because of their interference in the affairs of countries throughout the region, whether it's the overthrowing of Mossadegh in Iran and the imposition of the Shah, whether it is interference in Iraq. Remember 20 years of disastrous warfare in Iraq, which was a war crime. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. It did not have weapons of mass destruction. What we've seen the United States do, especially in the last 2 decades, is destroy country after country: Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon, Israel has, over the last few decades, turned Lebanon into a failed state with the support of the United States. So I think the actions of the United States, not just in terms of the Palestine-Israel conflict, but throughout the region, have been a major factor in destabilization and the factor in terms of the deaths and suffering of millions of people. It's really inexcusable. the United States bears tremendous responsibility for what has happened here, and for the thwarting of any kind of real democracy or any kind of real justice that, having lived in the Middle East for 7 years, I know many, many people are struggling to achieve.
Do you think this support is driven by the influence of Zionist lobby in America?
Yes, the Zionist lobby in the United States is tremendously wealthy, and within the United States electoral system, you can buy candidates, which the Zionist lobby does. So I would say we've reached a point where the Zionists own the U.S. Congress. That's how a war criminal, and there's an arrest warrant for this war criminal, Bibi Netanyahu, can still be invited to the U.S. Congress, and Congress people leap to their feet to give him a standing ovation. We have a system that I would describe as legalized bribery. And the Zionist lobby has learned to play that system very, very well. And that has driven, of course, we have to go back to the war in Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was something the Zionist project wanted done because Saddam Hussein ran a powerful country that the Zionists were frightened of. That is why the Zionists are pushing for a war with Iran. They wanted. That's why that they have been so destructive in Syria. Remember, the Israelis have seized now territory almost up to Damascus. The Golan Heights expanded into Lebanon. This vision of greater Israel are talking about the complete expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and the occupation of Gaza by Jewish colonists. And the United States is a full partner in this, I think, because of the power of the Israel lobby. Remember that Joe Biden received more money from AIPAC than any other senator. He still holds the record. He hasn't been in the Senate for over a decade. So yeah, unfortunately, we live in a political system where our political class has been bought up by the Zionists, and in exchange for that money, they do the bidding of the Zionists.
And what about the Christian Zionism?
Right, Christian Zionism is an important factor because many Jews in the United States, especially young Jews, are, and I think it's only become more apparent since the genocide, don't have that those emotional ties to Israel that their parents or their grandparents had. Christian Zionists, they have a biblical vision whereby, according to their eschatology, the Jews will take control of, quote unquote, the Holy Land in anticipation of the return of the Messiah. It's a form of magical thinking, but they have become fervent supporters of the Zionist project. I think there's also, because within, I wrote a book about them called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. We also have to remember that there's a strong strain of white supremacy within Christian Zionism. They look at what is happening in Israel as a classic settler colonial project, which it is. These are people like Netanyahu. They are of European descent. They are suppressing and breaking international law to crush movements, liberation movements by people of color. This is very much what the Christian Zionists want to do in the United States. It's why you're seeing the Trump administration carry out these, draconian purges of immigrants. There's a racial element to it. And then I would finally say that, and I covered the rise of, I would call it Jewish fascism, which comes out of Vladimir Jabotinsky, was expressed by these fascistic figures like Meir Kahane. The current Israeli government, they are heirs of the Kahane movement, the Koch party. And remember that Benito Mussolini called Vladimir Jabotinsky a good fascist. That's a quote. And you had leading Jewish intellectuals like Hannah Arendt, Sidney Hook, Albert Einstein denouncing that it was the Herut party as essentially fascistic. I mean, those are their words in a letter in the New York Times. The Herut party, that was the party that was formed after 1948, including Netanyahu's father, and they called for the complete removal of Palestinians from historic Palestine. And so I look at the Christian Zionists or the Christian nationalists as essentially our homegrown version of fascism, and I look at the figures around Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and other as Jewish fascists, and I think that they find a commonality in their fascism, and that is why they've created such a tight bond.
After 19 months of genocide in Gaza, what is the impact had this left on America's image in Middle East region?
America is exposed for what it is, and that is a full partner in genocidal projects, in unmitigated racism towards Muslims and Arabs, and a callous indifference to the rule of law, the Geneva Conventions, all of the mechanisms by which we would create a rules-based order. They've not only violated all of them, but they have actively persecuted those who have struggled to demand that these international laws, including the Genocide Convention, be upheld. I don't think there's any going back from this. I think the message, especially to the global South, is clear, and that message is we have everything, and if you try and take it away from us, we will kill you. The idea that the United States can ever turn around again and talk with any credibility about human rights is laughable. And that has always been the dark heart of American imperialism, but now it has been completely exposed to the rest of the world, as has the settler colonial project of Israel itself. I think this is a really seismic moment in history. I think that divide will never be breached again. I think that as we see climate change and the breakdown of the climate and climate refugees in the millions and soon to be tens or hundreds of millions, the mechanism by which industrial countries like Israel or the United States use to suppress movements that seek control over their own lives will replicate what we have seen in Gaza. That's my biggest fear, that the genocide in Gaza is not the end but the beginning. The United States is despised in most of the world, and it deserves to be despised.
How do you see the U.S. policies in the Middle East? Is it pragmatic or colonial?
It's not pragmatic at all, because it's very self-destructive to the ultimate or long-term interests of the United States by alienating country after country. The United States, and we can go back to the invasion of Iraq, has done the bidding of Israel. The invasion of Iraq was an Israeli project. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. Saddam's government was not a threat to the United States, much less to its neighbors. But Israel wanted Iraq as a unified country destroyed in the same way that Israel destroys Lebanon, same way they wanted to destroy the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, the same way they wanted to destroy Libya, the same way they want to destroy Iran. And they get the United States to essentially do their dirty work for them, because the Zionist lobby is quite influential within the foreign policy establishment. So it's not pragmatic. It's completely colonial and completely unjust, and serves the interests of the Zionists, I would say, ultimately, and not the interests of the United States itself.
Do you believe that U.S. disregards the Middle East security in pursuit of its economic interests?
It depends where in the Middle East. So clearly in the Gulf, the United States is tied to countries like Saudi Arabia because of its oil. In Iraq, after the occupation, anybody who tells you the war in Iraq wasn't about oil is lying. So there are resources, in particular oil in the Middle East, that the United States seeks to dominate. And foreign policy is formed to essentially serve those economic interests, without question. At the same time, there is there are powerful forces within the foreign policy establishment that do the bidding of the Zionists, which is not always in America's ultimate interests, including economic interests. But on the issue of oil, yes, foreign policy serves the interests of the oil companies, which is why the American oil companies seized the oil fields in Iraq after the invasion.
Sure. What's your opinion on U.S. coordination with al-Golani in Syria?
Well, the destruction of Bashar al-Assad's regime, which of course both the United States and Israel and Turkey were involved in, was about breaking the power of Hezbollah, because Syria was a transit point by which Hezbollah was supplied with weapons. It was about breaking the power of a regime that stood steadfastly with the Palestinians, that had a close relationship with Iran. So it was seen by the United States and by Israel as a regime that had to be destroyed. And the United States and Israel worked very hard to destroy the regime of Bashar al-Assad and replace it with the compliant regime of al-Jolani.
And now, what are your expectations for Syria's future?
Israel and the United States, and in particular Israel, are determined to keep Syria as a failed state in the same way that they have done in Lebanon. That's why you have seen the seizure of Syrian territory by Israeli forces. It's why you see periodic attacks carried out by the Israeli Air Force against the military infrastructure in Syria. They want to cripple the regime so that it doesn't pose any kind of a threat to the interests of the United States and Israel. That's the goal. That was the reason Bashar al-Assad was overthrown, and they will maintain that goal the same way they do in Lebanon. They will keep the state weak. They've already done that, and that's what they will maintain.
In your opinion, is there still hope for a just peace in our region?
Not in the short term. Israel has destroyed the possibility of a two-state solution with the genocide in Gaza, the massive colonization of the West Bank, including, especially since the genocide began, the seizure of more and more territory, the savage acts of violence within the West Bank, which again don't equal what's happening in Gaza, but have certainly, I think, indicated to many of us that once the Israelis finish with Gaza, if they achieve their goal, which is depopulating Gaza, they will attempt to do the same thing to the West Bank. So Israel has blocked the ability of a just peace. I think at this point, the only hope for a just peace is a one-state solution, and not a Jewish state, but some state of where everyone has equal rights, Palestinians and Israelis. But Israel's destroyed the process by which a just peace could be attained, and is now actively engaged in essentially trying to drive all Palestinians from historic Palestine and create a Jewish state where there are no Palestinians. That's their goal. So I'm very pessimistic in the short term. In the long term, I'm not sure that Zionist state is sustainable. But in the short term, I'm not hopeful.
After damaging Gaza, what about the future of Palestinian resistance?
Well, Israel has traumatized an entire generation of Palestinians who, many of whom have lost huge numbers, if not their entire families. Israel has destroyed their homes, their communities, and is attempting to displace them from their land. And we know there's a term, it's called blowback, and there will be blowback on the part of Palestinians, as there would be from anyone who suffered what Palestinians have suffered. If we've learned anything from the 7+ decades since the creation of the State of Israel, it is that the Palestinians will always resist. They've never stopped resisting. And I expect that resistance to continue, even if Israel is able to achieve its goal of depopulating Gaza.
Chris, you wrote extensively about the empire of illusion in the US. Do you think Gaza has exposed this illusion?
You're referring to my book, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. The Trump administration is almost solely about spectacle. It's not connected to a reality-based world. That's what the Empire of Illusion is about. The way we see ourselves is not the way the rest of the world sees us. We still continue to believe in the fiction that we promote democracy and virtue and human rights. None of this is true. I think the genocide has exposed that. So what I'm writing about there is the disconnect between our self-perception and the reality. And the wider that becomes, the more the United States reacts not to facts or not to reality, but to illusions, and the more dangerous the United States becomes.
You also wrote about the spiritual death of American civilization. Just tell me, how is that reflected in America's stance on Gaza?
Well, I think Gaza exposes the spiritual death of the United States. It illustrates that we don't stand for anything, that all of the values we claim to represent are a lie. Genocide is the crime of crimes. And I would say that the fact that we can back and support a genocide means that whatever soul, if countries can have souls, is dead. We stand for nothing but power and violence and control, and I think that is emblematic of a dying civilization.
In your book, war is a force that gives us meaning. Is what's happening in Gaza the final stage of this false power?
It's not a false power, it's the misuse of military power. So when empires are first formed, they're actually quite judicious about the use of military power. But as they lose influence and hegemony throughout the world, they seek to regain that power through military adventurism. And we saw that in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. These are all fiascos. I mean, we go back to Vietnam. They're failures, they're military defeats. And as the empire loses its hegemony throughout the world, it becomes more and more violent and more desperate. But that only accelerates the decline of empires. So for instance, when you had the Peloponnesian War run by the Athenian Empire, at the end of that war, they invaded Sicily, their fleet was sunk, their soldiers were captured, actually turned into slaves, and that's how empires die. So what we're seeing is essentially the classic pattern of the death of empire, because that loss of power, that loss of influence is not regained through violence. The decline is accelerated through violence. And that's what happened in Iraq, that's what happened in Afghanistan, that's what happened, I would even argue, in Ukraine.
So tell me, if you believe that Gaza conflict is part of broader global struggle between imperial powers and peoples who resistance.
Yes, I think that what's happened in Gaza has sent a message to the Global South. Remember, the Global South, the West only honors or acknowledges the genocide committed by the Nazis. But as Cesar Ami in his book Discourse on Colonialism writes, what the Nazis did to the Jews was essentially what they had done to the coolies in India, or blacks in Africa, or Arabs in Algeria. There was no difference. But these Holocausts are not acknowledged. The German Holocaust of the Namaqua and the Herero in modern-day Namibia are erased from the history. The Global South has always been acutely aware. I mean, you take the 1943 Bengal famine in India, where 3 million Hindus died, and Winston Churchill, who was the prime minister, reacted by saying they are a beastly people with a beastly religion. And so the sanctification of the Shoah or the Holocaust, which has been used by Israel as if they are the eternal victims, that's not been part of the history of the Global South, which is, I mean, look at the suffering of the Kenyans under British colonialism during the Mau Mau. So the Global South sees more clearly that genocide has always been part of Western imperialism, that it's not something that was exclusively visited upon the Jews. And so when they look at Gaza, their own historical memory tells them this is what the West has always done, what the West is always about, and of course they're right.
So what do you think the world will remember from this moment, and who will bear the burden of the history?
I think most of the world will see this moment as the dividing line between an old era and a new era. I think the West will no longer be able to successfully portray itself as morally superior. I expect that it will fuel stronger resistance movements within the Global South to Western imperialism, to Zionism. Of course, that's why the United States and Israel are working so hard to persecute those who stand up against the genocide and erase the history of the genocide. And it gets back to why I'm in Egypt. As a writer, I have to document this history because I can't allow this history to be disappeared. I can't, it's a small effort on my part to essentially block the attempt by Zionists to make people forget. I don't want them to forget. I want them to remember. But I think it's a very important moment in history.
Chris, how do you view the trade war between America and China?
Well, the United States is in industrial decline. China's economy is growing and will surpass the United States. And it is a desperate attempt on the part of the United States to prevent China's domination of a global economy and prevent their own economic deterioration. I'm not sure, I don't think it's going to work, but that's what it's about.
Does it lead to broader conflict between them?
This is our worry. There are strong forces within the U.S. government and the military that believe an armed confrontation with China is inevitable. We have seen a huge U.S. military buildup in the South China Sea, in essence an expansion of NATO, and warnings over any kind of occupation of Taiwan. I think it would be catastrophic, but yes, it potentially could see what is in many ways a cold conflict become a hot conflict in terms of, I think the flashpoint would probably be Taiwan.
What's your opinion in Donald Trump's statement that Egypt should allow U.S. ship to pass through the Suez Canal for free?
Well, Donald Trump has a habit of making idiotic statements all the time, turning Canada into the 51st state, occupying Greenland. And this is just another outburst on the part of a president with extremely limited intelligence and no real understanding of global relations or foreign affairs.
To what extent do you see the rise of populism in America as threat to democracy, both inside US and globally?
Well, the American system has seized up. We underwent a coup d'etat in slow motion. Both parties became essentially dominated by oligarchs and corporations. There was a deep frustration on the part of a working class that had been betrayed, in particular by the Democratic Party. And they did what betrayed populations do, which is turn to a demagogue, a con artist like Donald Trump, and embrace right-wing fascistic solutions, demonizing immigrants, demonizing Muslims, demonizing the poor. This is what happens when societies break down. So I think it is a threat to American democracy, which is disintegrating by the day. And this right-wing populism, whether we see it in Hungary, we've seen it with the rise of the right-wing party in Germany, of Marie Le Pen in France. It is a threat to the open society and to democracy. I think it's a very serious threat, but it's caused by these neoliberal policies that have essentially rendered whole sections of these societies superfluous, tossing them into the gig economy where they have no job stability, no benefits, and this is the reaction. This is what always happens. Aristotle writes that when you get oligarchic control, your only two choices are between tyranny and revolution. And of course, what we're seeing is the rise of tyranny.
Chris, what's your assessment of the Zionist movement?
Well, Zionism is racism. Zionism is about the exaltation of one religion, the Jewish religion, above other religions. Zionism is about the sanctification of Jewish victimhood. So in the eyes of Zionists, they are always the victims, no matter what they do, even if they carry out genocide. Zionism is a movement that believes that Jews have a divine right to the land that Palestinians have lived on for centuries, because it says so in the Bible, which of course is ridiculous. So there are many, many elements of Zionism that replicate, I would say, fascism, including the kind of blood and soil that was a movement, the what was called Lebensraum, the drive by the Nazis to take land that was not theirs in Eastern Europe to expand Germany. That's, of course, the whole project of Greater Israel. It is, you know, a movement that essentially denies the humanity of others and exalts Jews.
And now, what's your comment on the proposal of demolish Al-Aqsa Mosque to build the Temple of Sulaiman?
Well, it's utter insanity. Again, it goes back to the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, and the belief that you have a right to destroy one of the most important sites of Islam to recreate a temple that hasn't existed for, you know, almost 2,000 years. The consequences of it are catastrophic. It is, of course, part of the whole effort to erase any presence of Muslims within the land of historic Palestine. Remember, archaeology is weaponized by the Israelis so that they will dig through layer after layer, Ottoman, Byzantine, until they find evidence of or traces of Jewish settlement, but destroying all the rest. And I think that the destruction of the temple is very much part of that project.
Now, what's your assessment of Balfour Declaration?
So the Balfour Declaration was an effort on the part of the British to, in the middle of World War I, to gain favor with worldwide Jewry, to get them to support the war. It was an effort to create a colonial settlement within historic Palestine that would do the bidding of the British. And it, of course, in essence, immediately created an apartheid system whereby Jewish colonists who came from Europe and the outside had rights and privileges that the indigenous inhabitants, the Palestinians who had lived there for centuries, were denied. So it was a deeply destructive declaration.
Okay, and what about Sykes-Picot?
Well, Sykes-Picot, which also came out of World War I, was dividing the Middle East up into zones of influence, in particular between the British and the French, but later the Americans, drawing boundaries, right down the middle of, for instance, take the Kurds. You have Kurds in Turkey, Kurds in Iraq, Kurds in Syria, Kurds in Iran. So they're all divided by new borders. Sykes-Picot did tremendous damage because it created artificial states like Iraq, for instance, or Jordan, Transjordan. And I think many of the conflicts that we see today can be traced back to both the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi said that even if the U.S. succeeds in imposing normalization between Arab and Israeli occupation, there will no just and comprehensive peace without establishment of the Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, he's right, because if the Palestinians continue to be dispossessed, if justice is not achieved by the Palestinians, if Israel is allowed to continue its settler colonial project and its apartheid state, not to mention its genocide, then it kind of doesn't matter whether the Abraham Accords work or not. So yes, I would agree.
Yeah. Is Israel seeking to expand into other Arab lands using the excuse of security?
Yes, this is how Israel has justified its occupation of southern Lebanon. It is how it has justified its seizure of Syrian territory. It is how it is justifying its seizure of Gaza and the West Bank. They always carry out this attempt to create greater Israel in the name of so-called security.
Chris, how do you see the future of non-state actors like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Houthi?
Well, all of these non-state actors, Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, are resistance movements. Hezbollah was, of course, created to fight Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. Hamas created to fight Israeli occupation in Gaza and even the West Bank. The Houthis have courageously attempted to battle back actively by shutting down maritime shipping against the genocide. And these non-state actors, of course, have been heavily targeted, not only by Israel, but by the United States, because they have worked on behalf of the Palestinians and the Palestinian resistance movement. Well, and of course Hamas is part of the Palestinian resistance movement, but they are forces that attempt to fight back against Western imperialism and Zionism, and so they've been heavily targeted. But I don't know how the imperialist project or the Zionist project is going to be defeated unless there are resistance groups.
Okay, and now how do you assess the escalation of settler violence?
Well, ever since the attacks of October 7th, Israel has used the attacks as an excuse, not only to carry out genocide in Gaza, but to seize more and more territory in the West Bank and carry out egregious acts of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank in what I expect is a prelude to annexation of the West Bank. Remember that the government has equipped these Jewish colonists with automatic weapons, I think 10,000 automatic weapons, and they have formed rogue militias that go into Palestinian villages and terrorize and kill Palestinians. So what it's done is, or what we've seen with the escalation of settler violence is an acceleration of an attempt by the Zionist state to terrorize, displace, and impoverish the Palestinians in the West Bank so that when they are finished with Gaza, they can turn on the West Bank and attempt to do to the Palestinians in the West Bank what they want to do to the Palestinians in Gaza, which is drive them off their land.
What's your evaluation of Arab regime in handling with the Palestinian cause?
It's largely been rhetorical, and in some cases, as with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan, it's been active collaboration. I think that the lack of, or the fragmentation of Arab countries has prevented a unified response. I think at the very least there should be a no-fly zone over Gaza, and if Israel refuses to open the borders to stop massive starvation, those borders should be breached in the name of basic human rights and humanitarianism. But I don't see that happening either in the world community or in the Arab world.
What about Egypt?
Well, I mean, the question is whether the Israelis will attempt to push the Palestinians into the northern Sinai. I mean, Israel's withdrawn its ambassador. The Israeli press is constantly attacking Egypt, supposedly over a military buildup in the northern Sinai. So there are already tensions. You know more than I do, but my reading of it is that if, for instance, Israel breached the border, pushed Palestinians in defiance of the Egyptian government, pushed these people into the Sinai, that could lead to a catastrophic development and maybe even to hostilities. Whether Israel is willing to take that gamble, I don't know.
Do you believe that the world needs a new moral order?
The world needs a new non-aligned movement, the kind of non-aligned movement that was led by Tito, Nehru, and Nasser. And if we had a non-aligned movement with those kinds of figures behind it, this genocide would not be possible.
Can you tell me more about what you think about Jamal Abdel Nasser?
Well, he was an extremely important figure because he stood up to Western imperialism. He asserted the right of Egypt to control its own resources, its own history. He defied the Zionists, and he built alliances with other powerful figures, as I just mentioned, in India and in Yugoslavia, as a kind of bulwark against Western imperialism and Zionism. And in that sense, I think he was an extremely important figure.
How can we keep his previous efforts in our region?
I don't know. Sadat did a pretty good job of destroying it. But that's what we need. We need to go back to that.
In a time when grand narratives are collapsing, what is the role of the writer?
The writer is always tasked with giving a voice to those people who the powerful are seeking to silence. The writer is tasked with always telling the truth, even when that truth does not reflect well on the oppressed. The writer is tasked with lifting up voices of criticism and resistance that attempt to make the world a better place. the writer must tell the stories, which is why I'm writing my book, the stories of those who power are attempting to erase, and not just erase them as a people, but erase their stories as well.
And how can justice be achieved for Shireen Abu Akleh and other journalists have been killed in Gaza war?
Well, the killers have to be held to account. You need to know their names, and they need to be tried in an international court of justice. I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but in a just world, that's what would happen.
What should we do as a journalist to help?
We have to follow the example of our Palestinian colleagues and keep reporting, even at the price of our own lives. That's something that I had to deal with during the war in the former Yugoslavia, during the war in El Salvador, during the civil war in Algeria, which I covered, during the civil war in Yemen. It's dangerous work, but if there aren't people willing to do that work, then the world will be shrouded in darkness, the truth will never get out, and the voices of the oppressed will never be heard.
Finally, what do you have to say for Palestinian people on the anniversary of Nakba?
Keep resisting, keep resisting, keep resisting. Al-Nahar al-Bahar.
Yes. Palestine will be free, in your opinion?
It won't be free if we don't resist, so we don't have an option.
Yeah. Thank you for bravery and honesty.
Well, thanks for having me.